For a long time in this discussion about the position of the far right in Europe, Spain was held up as the exception. It hadn't seemed to have had an analogous growth of the far right. That came to an end with Vox, which was a right-wing split from the Partido Popular, who were kind of like our Tories. And last year they won 52 seats in the Spanish Parliament. And perhaps most depressingly, for the left, one of the areas they did particularly well in was Andalusia, which is traditionally a base of working class and I guess you'd say peasant support for the left and for socialist and social democratic parties. And I think that's a theme that it would be worth coming back to in the discussion. The ability of the hard right or far right to the populist right to make inroads into parts of European countries, which had traditionally been strongholds of social democracy or the communist parties or the labour movement, broadly speaking. And then I mentioned at the beginning Golden Dawn in Greece, where it strikes me, again, we've been extremely lucky in that a particularly virulent, pretty classically neo-Nazi party was getting something like 7%, 8% in the polls during the kind of the peak of the economic crisis. And it was serendipitous, really, that they misplayed their hand. And what became of Golden Dawn essentially was some of their members were involved in the murder of Pavlos Fyssas, who is a left-wing and anti-racist, anti-fascist rapper in the port outside Athens, and that murder created a revulsion against them in broader Greek society and led to a pretty devastating court investigation, which is revealed them to have operated like a kind of odd mix of an almost pagan cult and also quite a seriously armed criminal organization. So that's a little overview of it. And one might also add that in Eastern Europe you've got, if not a fascist government, then a seriously unpleasant nationalist right-wing Catholic government in Poland. And comrades will have seen in the news yesterday that things have gone bad for worse in Hungary, where Viktor Orban, authoritarian, right-wing, virulently anti-migrant, anti-Semitic leader of Hungary, has used the cover of the coronavirus crisis to give himself essential carte blanche, unlimited by time, to rule through a system of decrees until the coronavirus, he says, is finished, including very dangerous measures with regard to the spreading of fake news, which obviously you worry could be interpreted to mean any speech critical of the Orban government. I mean, Orban, it must be said, is not the only threat or even the worst threat in Hungary, when you've also got Jobbik to his right, who themselves, I think, got something like, see if I can get my notes up here, but got well over 1 million votes in the last Hungarian general elections. So if you've been to many meetings on fascism or the far right from revolutionary socialist organizations like ours, a lot of the discussion tends to focus on like sort of classical Marxist definitions of fascism. I think that is useful, and it also is not useful for trying to wrangle with what we've got in front of us today. So in Trotsky's writing about fascism, he's addressing mainly the Italian fascists and the German Nazis, and there he talks about getting to a point in a crisis of capitalism, like you had in Italy and you had in Germany, where the bourgeoisie itself is not really able to manage the social crises it produces, and to keep down an increasingly class conscious proletariat. And Trotsky argues that capitalism, or the capitalist class, then begins to search around for kind of lieutenants who would be able to do the job. Lieutenants who we wouldn't necessarily be happy to use all the time. It must be said that if you want a normal functioning capitalist society, fascism or wildly erratic strongmen type regimes are not ideal for capitalism. Capitalism, where it can, prefers a bourgeois democracy, which is a limited and biased and highly imperfect democracy. But generally, if you want to go around making profit through standard capitalist methods, you want a system which is pliable enough and has the kind of democratic safety valves necessary to let off steam of popular dissent, and which doesn't rely on either a massive kind of police state in order to maintain control, or involves the kind of the capricious turns of violent dictators like Hitler and Mussolini. But Trotsky argues there can come a point in capitalist crisis where segments of the capitalist class start to look towards fascism, start to look towards these kind of forces as a battering ram to batter a class-conscious proletarian movement and to help it regain a hold on society. Is that what's going on with people like Le Pen or people like, I don't know, or Salvini? It's not clear to me that the capitalist class particularly favours these people. Some sections of it might, but they strike me more as populists, with bases in the kind of middle class, bases in deindustrialized areas where working class people have lost, if they ever had, a sense of connection to a left-wing politics, to a labour movement politics. But I think the point, as I said earlier, is that you can get into a situation where you've got something much worse. So in the event that you were to have Salvini return to power, in the event that you were to have a Le Pen government and they implement anti-migrant measures, autarkic measures, nationalist measures that are supposed to sort things out for the little man and woman who they're supposedly standing up for. When those measures don't work, when they don't lead to an increase in living standards, what then? It's not obvious, or it's not necessary that the beneficiaries of that are the left. It can be further right. It can be fascists. Now, what can make the difference there, of course, is how the left responds to the rise of the far right, and I'll talk a bit about that, and then I think I'll open it up for discussion. So, I mean, there's two elements to it. There's the kind of classical discussion about anti-fascist measures, things like no platforms, physical confrontation of fascists on the street and stuff, which we could talk about in the discussion, but I want to talk more about how does the left react to this broader kind of far right, a populist far right, a far right of Trump and Bolsonaro and Salvini and people like that, which isn't necessarily a matter of confronting skinheads on the street, but more about how do you deal with opportunist, nationalist political currents that are winning over lots of working class minds. And I think the best way the left can arm itself for that conflict is on the level of ideas. Because if you've got layers of working class people who think that the reason for their crap pay, their crap housing, their, the feeling that the life is going down the pan, if they think that that problem is down to immigrants or refugees, or it's down to you know, the shady machinations of supranational organisations like the EU or something. They think that's really what's at root, and what's at the root of their problems isn't capitalism in general, and specifically their boss, their own capitalist class that's exploiting them. When you're faced with people believing in that, how do you win them over? And I would suggest that you don't win them over by meeting them halfway, by accommodating to those theories. I think you win people round to a left-wing alternative, a left-wing solution to capitalist crises, by being very forthright. That anti-migrant, anti-xenophobic arguments are wrong. Now, I'd say the left hasn't really done that particularly well. Everyone was very excited, and they were right to be excited because it was a big opportunity about Corbynism in the Labour Party. And in many ways, you know, Corbynism was a major departure from a lot of the bland centrist orthodoxy of the Labour Party before it. But actually, what they did in reaction to nationalism, and what Corbynism and the Labour Party said in response to all the whipping up of hostility about migrant labour, was really not great. On the question of Brexit, not only did they fudge the issue as best as they could, but on the specific question of whether migrant labour was responsible for undercutting people's wages, they were absolutely hopeless. Either they would speak two ways on the question, or even suggest that there was some truth to it. That's true of the Labour leadership, but also of the trade union bureaucracies, particularly people like Len McCluskey, who essentially went along with what the right was saying. And there's Labour movement, there's a dismal tradition of that kind of thought in the Labour movement, which we should probably discuss later on. But if you're trying to find a way that the left can take on the ideas of the far right and win people over to a better explanation of what is wrong in their lives, that kind of fudge is not going to cut it, and hasn't cut it, clearly hasn't cut it. Rebecca Long Bailey saying, oh, well, yes, people do want to have some sense of control over the changes that are happening in their society, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, did nothing to pull people away from voting for Boris Johnson and getting Brexit done. Did nothing to win people back over in places in the north where Labour had previously been strong. That's not how you win people's mind over. I think the other point is that we need to be developing an internationalist response to this phenomena. All of its hyping up of the nation state, this far right movement we are seeing around Europe and the world is very international. It's a global phenomenon, and they take ideas from each other and they cooperate with each other. And our response has to be the same if we're to stand any chance of winning. Not purely on a theoretical level, because it sounds like a nice lofty, left-wing thing to do, but just practically speaking. Because if we as the left, if we as the Labour movement want to hold up a path of struggle to workers that they plausibly think can improve their lives, then they need to see us winning. And we're not going to be winning if we fight battles in our own little national silos. The problem of the economic crisis in 2008, and possibly the even bigger economic crisis that could come out of coronavirus, is not going to be resolved nationally. The problem of a refugee crisis is not going to be resolved nationally. It's not, or certainly resolving it in a way that is anyway halfway humane and decent and treats refugees as people, that cannot be resolved nationally. On the questions of climate change, on the questions of automation and what that means for jobs, these are all issues that do not stop at the border. So the left and the Labour movement needs to be taking on nationalist ideas sharply, and it has to be coordinating its response across borders to outline a path out of the crisis that is based on an international working class and not on a kind of imagined national collectivity, and playing on that terrain that terrain of appeals to patriotism is never really going to be successful for us. I've kind of lost my thread a little bit there, possibly witted, so I'll leave it there and we can have a discussion.